Export to the cloud. Okay. It looks like they're still being admitted. So why don't we wait just like one more minute?
Yep.
Okay, great. Welcome everyone. I am Professor Lawrence Chua, and on behalf of the School of Architecture, it is with great respect that I acknowledge the Onondaga Nation, the people of the hills, and the firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous peoples on whose ancestral and unceded lands Syracuse University now stands. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Elizabeth LaCouture to the School of Architecture at Syracuse University, albeit virtually. Dr. LaCouture is currently at the University of Hong Kong, where she is an assistant professor in the Department of History and the founding director of the Gender Studies program. She also holds an appointment in the Department of Comparative Literature. Dr. LaCouture is a historian of women and gender in the Sinophone world. She is also a pioneer in the historical study of race in Asia. Her research combines the local histories of Chinese places with the transregional migrations of Chinese and global commodities to illuminate the individual experiences of everyday life beyond the totalizing narratives of the nation state. Methodologically, she expands traditional understandings of the archive to include non-written texts such as visual and material culture and architecture. Before joining the history department at Hong Kong University, Dr. LaCouture was a fellow in the Academy of Korean Studies, funded Korean Family and Comparative Perspective Research Group at the University of Illinois. Her research has been supported by the American Council of Learned Societies, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the Fulbright Hayes U.S. Department of Education. She has published articles in China Heritage Quarterly and the Journal of Design History. And her first scholarly monograph, which many of you have read, is At Home in the World, Family, House, and Home in Tianjin, China, 1860 to 1960. And that was published just last year. This book from which today's talk derives is a social and cultural history of Tianjin. It fills an elision in both women's history, which has privileged Euro-American case studies, and Chinese history, which has often overlooked the important role of women, by attending to a specifically Chinese women's history. In the book, Dr. LaCouture conjures a vivid tableau of life in the northern Chinese treaty port of Tianjin in the early 20th century. In particular, she draws attention to the ways bourgeois and petty bourgeois Chinese women were able to assert their own agency in the built environment, even if they were not part of the nascent architectural profession in China. By looking at modernity from the perspective of Chinese women, Dr. LaCouture's book makes two important innovations in the history of Chinese modernism. Well, it actually makes more, but two that I want to draw your attention to. One, she underscores the importance of women in the modern design process, and two, she redefines modernism as a process in which Western and Chinese elements were juxtaposed to produce what she calls a chimeric modernism. I really can't recommend this important book enough. And if you don't already have a copy, Columbia University Press has published a very affordable paperback version. Before we begin, I just want to draw your attention to some of the buttons at the bottom of your screen. So in addition to the chat, which is functioning, you can chat with everyone, although the transcript, even if you're chatting privately, is visible, will become visible to us. You can raise your hand if you have a technical issue, and I'll be in touch with you personally, privately via chat. And then we have a Q&A button. So as questions emerge, you're welcome to put them in the Q&A box. And then after Dr. LaCouture's lecture, we'll start going through the questions and open up a kind of discussion. And with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. LaCouture. It's all yours, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction, Lawrence. I want to thank the School of Architecture and Women and Gender Studies at Syracuse University for inviting me to this virtual talk this evening in Syracuse, this morning in Hong Kong. I especially want to thank all the administrative staff that made this happen, especially Andrew Malloy for making the technology work, and our captioner for doing the hard work of making this talk accessible to everyone. And a special thanks to my friend, Professor Lawrence Chua, not just for inviting me, but also for supporting me, a historian of women and gender and material culture in China, in my journey to do architectural history. So I really appreciate your camaraderie on this journey and supporting my ventures into architectural history. I'm going to share my screen right now with you all. Okay. All right, so we can see the slideshow. Okay, perfect. So the title of my talk today is Choosing a House in Tianjin, China, and it's material that's taken from my book, Dwelling in the World, Family, House, and Home in Tianjin, China, 1860 to 1960. And I want to talk about some case examples of people who chose particular houses, and sort of think about why they chose those houses and what those choices meant in terms of their everyday life. And I want to frame this in a larger discussion that I know many of you are students in Professor Chua's class, and I know he has been discussing this concept of decolonizing Chinese architecture with you all. And so the framework I want to think about is the idea of erasure, revisions, and then what buildings can do. The ways in which histories get erased by these sort of totalizing nation state or Eurocentric narratives, historical narratives, and then the ways in which we can use buildings, especially buildings like houses, to sort of rewrite those histories and bring agency back to Chinese people. So to introduce my framework, I actually want to begin with the beginning of my book, with the anecdote I start with, which began on a hot summer afternoon in 2005. And this is one of my early trips to Tianjin, where actually even before I was certain I was going to research Tianjin, I joined a tour with esteemed local Tianjin scholar, Liu Haiyan, of the city. So it was a group of American Taiwanese historians, and he took us through a walking tour of Tianjin. And here we began our tour on this hot summer afternoon in the old Chinese city at the Guangdong Huiguan, the Guangdong Association Hall, which apparently Sun Yat-sen had spoke there at some point. So we begin in the old Chinese city, and we make our way slowly southward through the different foreign concessions of Tianjin, and we end up on the tree-lined streets of the former British concession. And eventually we make our way into sort of a courtyard like this of attached single-family homes, probably built in the 1920s. And we're talking with Liu Haiyan about the history, and a couple comes upon us. And one thing I always really enjoyed about doing research in Tianjin is people in Tianjin are extremely friendly and, always willing to chat to you on the streets. So they start telling us about their apartment that they have recently purchased inside one of the houses, and they invite us in, ask us if we want to see it. So of course we take up that opportunity. So we enter the doorway, and what would have once been a single family home, but has since been carved into separate apartments. And so what would have been the entryway with sort of colorful tiled floors was now a hallway into this multifamily building. The floors were now sort of gray and stained, not as bright as they would have been originally. And we go off to the side onto the ground floor in what is this couple's two-room apartment. And so we're seated on a sofa in what would have likely been the parlor or the living room, looking across to what would have likely been the dining room, but was now being used as a bedroom. And the couple is telling us about their purchasing their apartment, renovating the apartment. And they said, we're not well educated, but our daughter is. And she said, don't ruin any of the original features. So we kept the crown moldings. We kept the original wood floors. We could view the original mantelpiece. They said, we just painted it because we really wanted to preserve the history. And Professor Leo said, yes, you did a great job. Your apartment is in wonderful shape. And then they looked at us with pride and they said, Chinese people could not have lived here before. This was only for foreigners. And Leo, the very esteemed historian of Tianjin, very politely said to them, actually, the majority of people who lived in the British concession were Chinese. And it was well over 90%. And he said, the people who lived in this house were most likely Chinese. Now, our hosts that afternoon were not alone in this belief that Tianjin's foreign concessions had been off limit to Chinese people. And on repeat visits to Tianjin, I would get this story again and again. So visiting the British concession, there's a lovely park there. And, some elderly woman would come up to me and say, once again, Chinese people could not enter this concession, but now we can live here. Or when I was house hunting, looking for flats, again, I would get that story. And what's interesting though, is it's always kind of told with a sense of pride that now we can be here. So at the same time that Tianjin residents were proud of the former European concessions and the city's European architectural heritage, they had also erased themselves and erased Chinese people from that history. And this erasure was followed by a revision of Tianjin's colonial history that helped to establish CCP political power in the following ways. First, the revisionist history establishes the modern nation state in opposition to Chinese feudalism and foreign imperialism. And it places the Chinese Communist Party as the legitimate leader of the nation state. And second, as the legitimate leader of the modern nation state, the party is also responsible for the contemporary prosperity of the people of the Chinese nation state. Thus, the ability to live in any part of the city, the ability to purchase an apartment, in fact, the ability to have a car, buy a cell phone, designer clothes, all these kinds of trappings of the so-called new middle class are all thanks to the party. This revision, though, also erases Chinese people from the history of Tianjin's foreign concessions. And it's Chinese people who invested in, they built, they lived in the British concession and in other concessions. The British concession had one of the most robust property markets in the city. And that real estate market was driven by Tianjin's residents. Chinese residents, both as investors and consumers of British concession housing. So first, as investors, the British concession was developed by an Anglo-American company called the Tianjin Land Investment Company. By the 1940s, Chinese members comprised over 60% of the investors in that company. Chinese people were also the consumers, the buyers, the renters. As you can see from these statistics, well over 90% of the people in the British concession were Chinese. And this was the case in foreign concessions across the city. To give you an example of how this played out, how British were minorities in their own concession, there were two schools. There was a British school and a Chinese school in the British concession. And actually the Chinese school was very sought after. That's one reason you might want to live in the British concession. The British school was always struggling and they were always asking for more and more money from the council because they didn't have the student enrollments like the Chinese school. So in 1932, there were 735 students in the Chinese school. And by comparison, 447 in the British school. And they were not all British. There were multiple nationalities, including Chinese students in the British school. And actually, to this very day, the Chinese school in the British Concession is one of the top secondary schools in Tianjin. So these Chinese people who invested in, owned, rented, and went to school in the British Concession and in foreign concessions across the city have been erased from the history of Tianjin's foreign concessions. This erasure is not simply about the CCP claiming power over the historical narrative, but it also reconfirms a Eurocentric mainstream world historical view that creates teleologies through binaries. And I'm actually glad that Professor Chua began with my idea of modernity and the chimeric modern, because it very much relates to rethinking these binaries. Right? Traditionally, these binaries, they're not just held in popular imaginations, but they're deeply entrenched in academic scholarship. Binaries of East and West, Chinese and European, traditional and modern. And these are not binaries of equal standing. Rather, one side is always assumed to be above the other, thus creating a dialectic that moves us through history from China being impacted by the West, which then sets the wheels in motion for the traditional to become modern. So it's not the binaries themselves that I take issue with. As I argue in Dwelling in the World, these binaries were present in the Tianjin modern, and they were experienced in everyday life. The problem is the way with which we have come to understand these binaries through this dialectical, teleological history of modernization, as opposed to a history of modernity. In the Tianjin modern, each element of a binary cannot exist without its mirror. Chinese becomes a style when juxtaposed against European style, and the modern is only visible alongside the lingering elements of the traditional. Each part of the binary is equally important to the other. In my talk today, I want to step out of the dialectics and the teleologies and spend some time dwelling among these binaries. For a moment, let's take history away from the politics of the contemporary nation state and from Western supremacies, and let's try to understand how people experienced a time and a place. Let's try to understand the politics of that place on its own terms by filling in the erasures and restoring historical agency to the Chinese people who dwelled in the city at that time. Chinese people who inhabited multiple architectures, aesthetics, and prescriptions within the course of a single lifetime, and even simultaneously at once. So today I want to talk about 3 people and 3 houses. I want to talk about Xu Puan, a native of Tianjin who was also a comprador for an international bank and someone who owned a courtyard house in the Chinese city. Shani Yun, the wife of a political leader who lived in multiple houses during her lifetime and sojourned in a European house in the Italian Concession. And Song Sik, an executive of the Tianjin Postal Office who preferred to live in Western style in the Italian Concession. All 3 of these people lived in Tianjin at different times and overlapping times during the first half of the 20th century, and each of them chose a particular house. And just to orient us to Tianjin very quickly, here we are, a map of China. Tianjin is to the southeast of Beijing, established as a treaty port city in 1860. So it was the largest port in the north. It grew to be the 2nd largest city in China, second to Shanghai, by the early 20th century. And here is what Tianjin looked like in 1899, right? This is a map of Tianjin where we also see a certain kind of cartography, a certain kind of sense of space. Those of you who are students of Chinese space and architecture will recognize the walled Chinese city. It's built on a north-south axis, but you'll also notice interesting things in this map, like the trains. You see smokestacks in the distance. So here's a vision of Tianjin in 1899. Now, only, about a short few years later, by 1912, here's another map of the city. So it's a different kind of cartography, a different kind of representation. It also highlights the multiple foreign concessions that were set up over time along the Hai River. And by this time, 1912, the old walled Chinese city, the wall had been torn down after the Boxer uprising. So what you see there in the top is no longer a wall. It's sort of the shadow, the erasure of the wall, if you will, replaced by roads. And so that original kind of grounding around the city wall had been very violently disrupted and torn down. And the cosmological centering of the city was really kind of displaced and manipulated by these foreign concessions, kind of pulling away from the old city down along the side of the river. So this is also, a very violent restructuring of space. So we want to think about not just, now people, they can choose a Western house or a Chinese house. There's actually colonial violence and destruction and reconstruction that comes along with this new reconfiguration of space. But of course, people do also now have agency in this new space to choose where they want to live. And Chinese people could choose to live freely anywhere they wanted to in the city, with some limitations. So first of all, they had the choice of what kind of house they wanted to live in, right? Did they want to live in a Chinese courtyard house? Or did they want to live in a Western style single family house, or in a Western style apartment, or in an attached townhouse? They had the choice of what district or what location they wanted to live in. Did they want to be, if they worked in a bank, did they want to be close to work in the finance district and live in the British concession? Did they want to be near particular schools? Did they like the way the water tasted in the French concession more than in the British concession, right? So they could choose the location, but there were limitations. As I noted, Tianjin really took off in population size in the 20th century. There was a big population boom with people moving in. So you have a housing crisis, you have limited availability of where you can live. And if you're an outsider to Tianjin, chances are you can't live in the old Chinese city. There's not availability for rent there. And then you're also really limited by cost. Because with this housing crisis, housing prices were quite high, and a lot of wealthy Chinese people were actually buying up the prime real estate. So what could you afford to buy? What could you rent? Was your employer limiting your budget? So there was choice and there was limitations. And also I should mention that here we're also talking about this sort of flexibility and agency that elite people had, because the foreign concessions really did not care about public housing. And this is something I addressed towards the end of the book. It's not until after World War II, when the city is restored to its original, Chinese sovereignty, does the local government even start talking about public housing, right? So if you are from the laboring classes, you are even more limited in where you can afford to live. I also want to emphasize too, although people had agency to choose a house, houses also exhibited agency in how they shaped people's individual identities, especially their gender and status identities, through the spatial technologies and prescriptions that framed everyday life in individual houses. Houses contained ideologies, held ritual significance, embodied systems of belief, and framed social prescriptions. People could choose the type of house they wanted to live in, or decide how to decorate it, but they could not tear down load-bearing walls. Thus, to choose a house was to select a particular set of prescriptive social spatial practices. In Treaty Port Tianjin, people chose houses, but houses also shaped people. So the first house and the first person I'm going to talk about is Xu Puan and his courtyard house. So very few courtyard houses remain in Tianjin's old city. In the late 90s, the old city was demolished to rebuild a new old city. And so, an imagination of so actually it's an erasure. Let's knock down the old architecture and then build a revisionist, almost like, wushu movie film set, their vision of what old China should look like. So when everything was being knocked down, this is one of the few houses that was saved, and it's now serves as a museum. And so when you are entering, from the street, this house, like a typical Northern Courtyard house, you can't see beyond the gray brick front wall. So you don't really know what is beyond, right? You come upon this doorway, which in late imperial China, families may have put announcements on the door to, share good news. But you don't really know who the inhabitants are when you come upon this. And again, it's built on a north-south axis, principles of, feng shui. So when you enter the doorway, you come upon this screen, and this screen is there to sort of regulate the energy of the home, to stop sort of energy from rushing in and energy from rushing out. And then there's this corridor along the eastern side. So you can go through the corridor to the sort of more inner chambers of the house, or you can enter the first courtyard, which would have been the more, let's call it, outer portion of the house. So gender, and actually let's go to all the way to the back, right? And so here we are in a back courtyard. This is my friend, Professor Leo, once again, and this is one of the more inner areas of the house. What do I mean by inner and outer? Gender relations were formulated around this concept of inner and outer, or ne and wai, with inner being female, outer being male. These are relational concepts, relational spheres. So that the home is an inner to the outer world of the realm, but also within a home, you have inners and outers. It doesn't quite function the same way in the Western public-private idea. And so gender is being regulated according to inner and outer, but what about social relations in a house like this? So a courtyard house is really built around the ancestral altar. So age hierarchy is constructed in relation to the altar. So the household head, his portion of the house would be closest to the altar. Let's say maybe the youngest son, he would be furthest from the altar, but also social relations. So if you see in the back, sort of the most northern section, the northwest section of the house, there's sort of this row of buildings that's outside the courtyard. That likely would have been the kitchen, the servant quarters, right, farthest from the ancestral hall, which would have been in the front courtyard. So in this house, gender relations would have been constructed on inner and outer, these relational spheres, but then social relations would have been constructed on the north-south axis in connection to the ancestral hall. And this is important to keep in mind when we get to talking about Sung Sik and his house later on. Okay, so this is a house owned by Xu Pu'an. This is where Xu Pu'an worked. He worked as a comprador at the Chartered Bank of India, Australia, and China in the British Concession. This is a 1924 building. And Xu, although he worked in the British Concession in the financial district, he chose to live in, or at least own, a Chinese-style courtyard house in Tianjin's old city. We may posit that Xu, a native Tianjiner, wanted to remain close to his native roots, even though at this time, many well-to-do native Tianjiners were leaving their natal homes to live in the foreign concessions. Or perhaps Xu felt that life in a courtyard house better suited his family. He may have even kept a separate apartment in the concessions to be close to work while his family lived in the home. There are any number of personal factors may have driven Xu's decision to maintain a family house in the old Chinese city. But there are two political consequences to this. First, Xu Pu'an and his house demonstrate that a man could choose to participate and benefit economically from Tianjin's colonial capitalist system, and at the same time exert individual autonomy from that system by choosing a different spatial ideology for his personal life. Xu may have been a member of Treaty Port Tianjin's global financial elite, but he was also firmly grounded in a Tianjin local. So he could choose to be both global and local. And let's just say, as a comprador, as a male comprador, he had that agency to choose. Second, just as a single person could dwell and work in Chinese and European architectural technologies at the same time, Tianjin was a city where both technologies existed alongside each other. Even after the Qing Empire had fallen and Tianjin became a colonized space, the Courtyard House, which had been designed in accordance with very distinct late imperial political technologies of space, continued to shape the social relations and practices of Chinese urbanites like the Xu family. And indeed, my hypothesis is that the house may have even been constructed after the fall of the Qing. Xu Pu'an's Courtyard House in Tianjin's Old City reveals that earlier social spatial relations did not disappear from Tianjin's landscape and from Chinese people's lived experiences after the city was multiply colonized and geographically and architecturally altered. So the next person that I want to look at is Shiyan. And in 1917, Shiyan and her husband moved into a 4-room, 2-story house in Tianjin's Italian Concession. And this is not the exact house, but it's an example of a house from the Italian Concession. Her Western style house rented for $70 per month and featured a yard with grass in the front, a separate kitchen built in the back, and running water with a modern bath. Writing her memoirs over 40 years later, Shun suggested that their decision to live in the Italian Concession had been determined by availability rather than choice. According to Shun, the Italian Concession had more vacant housing than other parts of the city due to its remote location away from the city business center, not to mention a micromanaging concession government that drove many Chinese residents away. And it's actually in Shiyan's memoir that I learned that the Italian concession government used to go banging on doors to break up mahjong parties because they had legislation against gambling at home in the concession. And this wasn't any kind of Italian morality. They wanted people to gamble in their casino in the Italian club. And so, Shiyan said many, people didn't like to live there because they didn't want their mahjong parties broken up. But there she goes. She goes and rents a place. And you can tell in her memoir, she was keenly aware of the politics of colonial space at the time. She recalls in her memoirs, and I quote, that she didn't like the idea of living in a foreign concession, but she had to yield to circumstances. And she also notes, this is the first time she had lived in a Western style house in China. So first of all, she could not have rented a courtyard house in Tianjin since she was an outsider. But it wasn't that she was uncomfortable with Western living. I don't think that this was the issue. Because prior to this, Shun had lived in an apartment in Berkeley, California, when her husband and she were in exile. And in Berkeley, it was not the apartment or the Western lifestyle per se that she had to adapt to, but instead she talked about the lack of domestic help in the US that made everything challenging. So she notes for the first time in her life, she had to shop for groceries, she had to do the cooking, these kinds of things that for an elite family in Tianjin or in China, you would always have an abundance of domestic labor. And in the United States, she found herself having to fend for herself all of a sudden. So by all accounts, her life in Tianjin was much easier than her life in Berkeley. Now, from the beginning of her memoirs, Shun narrates her life through the houses that she lived in. She begins with her childhood home in Zhejiang, a compound that her grandfather built after the Taiping Rebellion that housed the multi-generational Shun family household at the turn of the century. The compound was comprised of 3 rows of 2-story buildings with 3 yards, all enclosed by a brick wall. Each building had 6 suites, 3 on each floor. Ground floor rooms were reserved for guests and family use, while the second floor rooms contained the family's private quarters, with each of the family's 4 sons occupying an individual suite with his wife and children. So first of all, the description of the Zhejiang style house is very even foreign to a northern courtyard house. So even within China, we have multiple architectural technologies that people would have dwelled in within a lifetime. But one thing I found very interesting in this story right off the bat, when she talks about this sort of multi-generational, multi-household family compound, never once does she call it feudal. Right? Never once does she talk about it through that revisionist narrative. What's interesting is she calls it middle class. She says, I was born into a middle class family, which I think is very interesting. At the end of her life in the US, actually, she's writing this. She thinks of it that way. But she doesn't call it this kind of feudal family structure. Shun left Zhejiang to study in Tianjin at Beiyang Normal School for young women, and she married Wang Fu, a prominent politician. With Huang, she lived in a series of houses and apartments from Shanghai and Tokyo to Berkeley and Singapore before returning to Beijing in 1916. And then in Beijing, she describes living in what she calls a typical Chinese house. Although coming from Zhejiang, she would not have grown up in a typical northern Chinese house, but this is what she calls it. She notes that it faced south with a private bedroom and sitting room in the back and more public rooms to receive guests in front. She recalled the paved courtyards as sunny, filled with potted flowers like chrysanthemums in the fall. Indeed, she seemed very reluctant to leave this Beijing courtyard house for the Tianjin villa. Now, in Shun's memoirs, she does not tell us why she moved from one house to the next. And to find out the reason, we have to turn to her husband, Wang Fu's entry in the 1925 edition of Who's Who in China. And there we discover that each move from one house to the next was initiated by an opportunity or a crisis in his political career. So when Yuan Shikai died in 1916, Shun and Huang moved to Beijing from overseas, but by 1917, things had gotten dicey and Huang needed to escape the political turmoil in Beijing, and he moved to Tianjin to concentrate on his writing. So that's according to the Who's Who, which also lists multiple publications and lectures that Huang completed during his sojourn in Tianjin. Shun, however, doesn't talk about the political motivations for the move, doesn't talk about her husband's writing, although she does discuss lots of intellectual conversations that they had with each other. But when she talks about living in Tianjin, she discusses the need to hire 2 servants, a husband and a wife, to maintain their small Western-style house, since they received far fewer guests. And she talks about needing to pass the time while her husband has retreated from public service. So she turns to sewing slippers and clothing, a skill she had learned in her natal household, where the women practiced embroidery and made all the clothes for family members. Wang Fu died in 1936, and Shun eventually moved to New York, to a suburb of New York City, where she lived with her daughter. In those final years, encouraged by her friend, Hu Shi, Shun recorded the details of her private life for the public record, working on her memoirs. In exile, during the final years of her life, Shun felt an acute conflict in the United States. She observed that, and I quote her here, the people of the middle and the lower classes could not afford servants. Shun, who was more comfortable managing a staff of servants than cooking dinner for herself, took care of the household for her working daughter. And as she tried to manage the house and write her memoirs, Shun, she says, often found her papers blown away and pots burning and boiling over. So Shun's memoirs tells us 3 things. First, that houses are distinct. Shun was acutely aware that different kinds of houses in different places required different kinds of living in terms of maintenance, servants, housekeeping. And Shun shows us how houses shaped people. It's not simply that Berkeley was different than Beijing, but that a Western house in the US required a different way of living than a Chinese courtyard in China did. Second, she shows us that to be a Chinese cosmopolitan elite during the first half of the 20th century was to live in different kinds of houses across one's lifetime and to be able to adapt to living in different kinds of houses. Shun never found life in a particular house difficult. it was with the role of the American housewife she was forced to play in Berkeley, and later the housebound grandmother in New York, that she found discomfort. Shiyan epitomizes the title of the book, Dwelling in the World. She was a cosmopolitan elite who felt equally at home in a Berkeley flat, in a Tianjin Italian Concession house, or a Beijing courtyard, fashioning her identity along the way. And 3, Shiyan's memoir shows us that houses were not simply backdrops. They were the frames of history. Shiyan did not just adapt to different spaces. She narrated her life through each space, right? Everyday life in different homes drove her memoir. Shiyan chose her houses, but her houses also shaped her. And the last example I'm going to share with you today is Sung Sik, who in 1923 moved to Tianjin as the acting deputy commissioner of the Tianjin branch of the Chinese post office. And the Chinese post office was a kind of multiply colonized space. It was run by foreign colonials, but also included Chinese local staff. And so when Sung moved to assume his post in the postal office, he and his family chose to rent a Western-style house on Via Conte Galena in Tianjin's Italian Concession. And so this is an example of a house from Tianjin's Italian Concession that likely could have been Sung Sik's house. And you can see the Italian Concession located just to the southeast of the old Chinese city across the river. And Via Conte Galena is highlighted there in red on the close-up of the concession map. Now, his rent initially in 1923 was $85 a month. In 1924, a year later, the Belgian real estate developer Crédit Foncier, which owned his house, decided they would raise the rent by 10 Chinese dollars to $95 per month. And so Sung had to go to his employer to ask them to increase his rental allowance. And so to give you an idea, to put this rent in context, I'm going to turn to the postal accounts. These are from the Tianjin Municipal Archives. And these are the accounts for 1923, right, in which Sung's rent was $85, which was about $24 less than a Chesterfield sofa. So sofas were sort of a new piece of furniture that would go in the Western style living room parlor. They were also pricey. It's a big investment to purchase a sofa. But $85 was $50 more than a grade 1 icebox. So a top of the line icebox, refrigerator. But this is where it's really striking when we are talking about elites. His rent, 1 month's rent, was more than 6 times the salary of a laborer, of a Chinese laborer, who they were paying between $9 to $15 a month. So this really gives you a sense of the discrepancy between these elites who had agency and the laboring classes of the city. So how did Sung justify a rent that was expensive even for a high-ranking bureaucrat in a Sino-foreign government institution? So the first thing he may have done, probably the reason why he went for this particular house, though he doesn't use it as a justification, is availability. The correspondence doesn't mention it, but he had to go where things were available. And if we look at his name, the Cantonese spelling Sung Sik, of the Mandarin Song Shuo, Mr. Sung was not a local Tianjiner. He was likely from the southern province of Guangdong. And new migrants to Tianjin rarely settled in the old Chinese city. Moreover, hailing from the south, a northern courtyard house may have been equally foreign to him as a Western-style single-family home. But anyway, he doesn't really quite mention availability. One thing that is mentioned is work convenience. The Italian Concession, although not convenient to the finance district, was very convenient to the train station. It was very close to the train station. And Sung mentioned in his request that it was convenient for him as postal commissioner to be able to get to the train station on a moment's notice, because there were lots of problems in those days with bandits attacking the rails and mail getting held up. And he could basically get to the train station from his home by rickshaw in about 15 minutes. So to give you an idea, once again, here's the Italian concession. The sort of yellow highlight is this, the center of the concession. Via Conte Galena is just to the north of it. The East Station is to the east, and it's circled in yellow there. So he would have been very close. So that could have been an argument. So either it's all that's available or it's very convenient for work, could have been great arguments to get the rent increase. But what ends up working is something that actually seems quite frivolous. When Sung first moved into the house in 1923, a foreign commissioner sort of wrote on his behalf for his request, and that he wrote that the house was considered quite suitable for Mr. Sung, who has a grown-up family and lives in foreign style. And Sung sort of reiterated that language in his request, and he said, "This house has proved suitable for myself and my family." In his request to increase Sung's rental allowance, once again, the commissioner reiterates these sentiments from the year before, and he notes, owing to the present unsettled condition in Tianjin, a suitable house at the present rate is not obtainable. So he brings up availability, but it's the availability of something that is suitable. So the Central Post Office must have found Sung's request for suitable housing compelling, as they approved the rental allowance, and they increased it shortly after receiving Sung's memorandum. On the other hand, they denied his request for a personal rickshaw. So this makes me think that, you know, this idea that I need to be close to here for work didn't convince them. Otherwise, they would have given him a rickshaw. It was really the suitability that convinced this kind of Sino-colonial institution that Mr. Sung should have the rental increase in this house. So what does it mean? What is a suitable Western style house, right? What did this suitable spatial technology look like? The great thing about this request is it included blueprints. It's very hard to come across these things, you know, again, erasures. There are just traces in the archives where we can find these, but the archives included the blueprints to his house. And again, it's very challenging and costly to copy or photograph blueprints in the archive. So this is my initial sketch when I came across it. And later I actually had my daughter draw it up for the book. So it's very schematic. So architecture students, I know it probably doesn't even all play out in the end, but this is kind of a schematic mapping of what Sung's house would have looked like. So the first thing I think that's interesting about this house is it sits in the Italian Concession, which was deliberately zoned for private housing only. Okay, so some concessions had mixed use, sort of public and business and private and residential, but the Italians wanted to be only residential. So first, they're kind of inscribing this Western notion of public and private. But as I come upon the house in the Italian Concession, whereas remember Chupuan's house, I come upon a gray brick wall, I come upon this giant glass picture window, right? So not only do I see the whole facade of the house, but I can even see into the house. So on the one hand, we have this private space, but it is almost becoming more public, visible to the street, increased visibility. Now, if I enter the house, I likely would first enter the drawing room, right? Or the sitting room. So kind of one of the most public space of the house. And that would lead me into the dining room, which would also be a public space of the house. Then I would go upstairs, and upstairs I would come to 2 private bedrooms and then another private bedroom. So this is again different than the Courtyard House, where each individual sort of small family within the greater household would have a section, either a whole courtyard or a section of a courtyard house that they would share as a household. Here we have each individual family member having an individual space, a bedroom. This is the prescription. How did people use this? But this is the prescription of the space, that each individual has a private bedroom. So inscribing notions of privacy into the space. Let's go back downstairs. So downstairs from the bedroom, through the drawing room, and into the basement. And it's in the basement that we find the kitchen. And if you recall, I mentioned Shiyan, her kitchen was in the back. And this is something interesting because on the one hand, we might suspect that Western houses would prescribe sort of Western ideas of domesticity and gendering of space, where the kitchen is a female space, right? But what's really interesting in Tianjin, because you'll recall, and in China at this time, Shiyan saying, I can't believe there's no domestic labor in the US. Right, in China, there was an abundance of domestic labor. So most families would have employed people to do the cooking, to do the cleaning at home. And so the kitchen was not a female space. It was a space of the domestic laborer. So even in the foreign concession homes, it's in the basement, it's behind the house. It's not this kind of Western domesticity, kitchen as women's laboratory that we might assume we'd see in the 1920s and 30s. So here the kitchen is in the basement, right? It's next to the heat, it's next to the cold, the servant is down there. So again, let's think back to Xu Puan's house, where social relations are constructed on the sort of vertical axis. Here we literally have master living above servant. So a different notion of social relations being inscribed into the house. So unlike Xu Puan and Shiyan, the traces we have of Sung Sik's story and his Tianjin house erase the other kinds of architectural technologies that must have framed his life. And this is likely because we encounter it in the colonial archive, and he's got to make an argument to the colonials that this house is suitable. So, there's an erasure of any other kinds of architectural technologies that we know he would have dwelled in across his life. And while Xu Puan's courtyard house asserts his autonomy from the colonial capitalist system, Sung Sik leverages the system's assumptions that Western is better or more suitable to increase his rental allowance. So he's playing the game to get what he wants. So what do these three people and their three houses tell us? Everyday life in a 20th century Tianjin was about navigating different spatial technologies. Xu Puan, Shiyan, and Sung Sik may have chosen to live in a Chinese or Western house for different reasons, but they each experienced both of these architectural technologies across their lifetime. And I should note, they experienced multiple Chinese architectural technologies and multiple Western architectural technologies. There's not one Western, one Chinese. Whether they were passing through like Shiyan and Sung Sik, or whether they could trace deep local roots like Xu Puan, the residents of Tianjin inhabited a world in which Chinese and foreign ideas, technologies, and styles coexisted. For these individuals, modernity was not defined through Western progress, but rather through a cosmopolitan combination of Western and Chinese temporalities and cultures. To be modern meant to be comfortable dwelling in both of these worlds. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. That was really illuminating. I'd like to just also take this opportunity now to, let the audience know you're welcome to add more questions to the Q&A. We already have quite a few that I'm hoping we'll get to answer all of them. I wanted to take advantage of my position as moderator to ask you the first question, though. So you talked about, I really liked how you framed at the beginning architectural history as being able to address certain absences or erasures from a more kind of document archivally oriented history. And your book covers a very long, very tumultuous period in Chinese history, right? You've got the disintegration of the imperial dynasty system, the founding of the republic, the warlord period, the civil war, the anti-Japanese, the founding of the People's Republic of China, the Cultural Revolution. And I'm just curious, at the end of this project, meaning like now that the book is out, reflecting back on it, what does architectural history do that a more kind of document archive oriented history doesn't? How does architectural history break up that kind of teleological aspect of historical narrative for you?
That's a really great question. I feel like I don't have enough distance to self-reflect yet, but I'm going to do my best with that. I think for me, really taking seriously buildings in space and bodies living in space, and really beginning from this idea of imagining what the city looked like and then imagining the violence of the reconfiguration, and then having traces. There are still traces in the city that can help you imagine what that looked like. To me, when I'm thinking about people living in space, it sort of brings me beyond the filtered narrative of written sources at the time, of the filtered narrative of the historical frames that we have to deal with, and really to take the spaces on their own terms and imagine the bodies in the spaces. And architecture speaks through a discourse. It certainly does, but it speaks in a different way than somebody writing about the period. So I also think to combine the discourse of the building with the discourse of the people talking about the buildings, then like putting them in dialogue with one another helps us to get, or people talking about it, or with women's magazines talking about it. So I think putting the buildings in dialogue with the textual sources helps us to get closer to the feeling of what life may have been like on the ground at the time. And, in the end, as a historian, that's what I'm most interested in, is trying to reconstruct, what did it feel like for people, even as all these tumultuous things are going on around you in the world. You're still living everyday life. And so I think buildings help us to see that and frame that in a way that texts alone don't do.
Right. Thank you.
The other thing too I want to know about sources, is that it's very challenging working in archives, working with limited library sources. So I was very fortunate at the time that I started working in Tianjin. The city hadn't undergone such a redevelopment that it since has. So there was a lot of architecture there as sources. So part of it is I couldn't get these sources in the archives. So like I couldn't get blueprints. I can't get the Tianjin Land Investment Company records because they're closed, but I can see the houses they invested in, right? And I can see ruins of houses in the new Chinese city that I'm sure aren't there anymore. So it was also a way to get sources that you would not have been able to get otherwise.
Right. Well, for us, the building is also an archive, and maybe, a primary archive at that. So Wang Yushan asks, he thanks you for your presentation. You mentioned the housing price as one of the limitations that Chinese people met when making choices of which house they wanted to live in. So middle-class people who are wealthier were more representative, in your case studies. What do you think of the role that people from lower social classes played in the history of Tianjin, architecturally, socially, and politically?
Well, they built the houses and they cleaned the houses, they took care of the houses, they took care of the children in the houses, right? So they are part of that, they're part of that history. What I do think is interesting in the history of housing is that certainly and actually this, it really makes me understand, it illuminates the privatization of the housing market today, right? In the US, you're facing this housing crisis because it seems ridiculous to me that it is left to the market to house people, right? And so we see in Tianjin, it is really greedy investors that want to build like the best housing to get the best investment. They don't care about housing people. And the British concession is very blatant. They really don't care about housing the working classes. And so, you know, we see that when we're left to its own devices, this colonial capitalist market, nobody cares about the working classes. There are very few attempts to do anything in Tianjin. In Shanghai, you have some kind of social organizations that try to build social housing, but there's very little attention until 1945. And this is why, in the end, I extended the book past 45, because 1945, once the city is decolonized, the government starts thinking about housing and they come up with a plan that they call like Shiyan, people's housing, like this urbanites housing. They come up with a plan. But then it's really the Communist Party that makes housing their priority, right? And so this is very important to address that crisis. But I will note that on the one hand, when they are addressing the crisis, but they are also building cadre housing, which mimics the middle-class bourgeois elite housing of the earlier era. So we are addressing the housing crisis, but there is this legacy of the elite kind of middle-class single-family housing that comes out of this era that continues to influence housing policy into the early communist period.
All right. I think, you know, this is a really great question, and in many ways, it's a question that as historians we're still grappling with, right? Like, how do you tease out like the voices of those classes that are not collected in the archive, right? Where it's as true as possible to what these classes actually thought and felt and how they lived, without being a kind of active ventriloquism, right? Where these are actually just my ideas.
I will add one more thing to that too. This is something that social scientists were really interested in, right? So Sidney Gamble, he looked at kind of working class families in Beijing. I think Tao Menghe looked at workers in Tianjin. So there was a lot of the spotlight sociologists put on the working classes at the time. So there is that kind of evidence that is there. But I think the goal of this project was to actually fill in this erasure of this middle class that had been completely erased because middle class don't look at their own housing, right? They like to look at the working class housing. So it's a great question.
Okay. So Michael Ayerdo had a related question. When you speak about agency and presence and likewise erasure and omission of Chinese people from the architectural narrative to control political power, could you further elaborate how might the manipulation or restructuring of the built environment within the Chinese housing settlement of Shiyan, how that might work to play into the perception of the area, particularly the Chinese versus Eurocentric perception, or even class distinction?
I'm trying to make sense of the question. Is it wanting to know how Chinese perceptions of Eurocentric architecture?
Yeah, maybe why don't we give Michael an opportunity to flesh out the question a bit more, to clarify, and we can go on to Xu Xiaoshuan's question, you mentioned as the population increased in Tianjin that the new Chinese that were moving in could only rent places in the concessions. I was curious about this also. Do you think the concessions for Chinese people who is not housed in Tianjin was caused by the concessions people who I had a similar question, which was why they were not welcome in
The
the
old
Chinese
Chinese city.
walled city. Yeah.
So, you know, basically in the Chinese walled city, you have sort of the old Chinese families had their houses in there, right? But then there was this area in between the old city and the start of the concessions that was kind of like a lower status area, shall we say, that a lot of people coming in could have lived there. And then there was also the new Chinese city across the way. And then there were the foreign concessions. So, you know, coming in, if you are an elite, you're an elite Chinese person, it's unlikely that you could rent a courtyard house. You know, if you're a lower status person, you might live in your workshop, you might, you know, be able to rent a space or a room somewhere. But for these elites, courtyard houses just were not available for them to rent.
And, you know, I guess to pick up on the last part of Xiaoxuan's question, was the decision to live in the concessions, you know, something that was driven purely by pragmatic reasons, or yeah.
Well, there's another thing too. There's another issue, is that this is a period of unrest and violence. And so if you live in the foreign concessions, you've got a foreign police force, you've got foreign military, you know, so you have protection. So living, you know, many people chose to live in, even native Tianjiners chose to live in the concessions because they were safer, right? So living in the Chinese city, you didn't have those same protections that you would have in the concession. So that could have been another reason. And, you know, making an investment for some of a lot of, you know, a lot of Manchu royal elites invested in real estate, you know, and a lot of people, it was the style and the lifestyle, right? That they also were choosing to live this kind of urban life. Like Zhang Shuiliang, right? The famous warlord involved in the kidnapping of Jiang Jieshi. He lived in Tianjin, and he was kind of known as the playboy of the, he lived in the concessions. He would, you know, party at the Astor Hotel. So there's also a certain lifestyle, you know. Last Emperor Puyi, he lived with a friend in the Japanese concession. So there's pragmatic decisions, but also for some of these elites, it's sort of a lifestyle they're buying into as well. Yeah.
So Andrea Ho had an interesting question that dovetailed with one of my own questions, which was, so she asked, how does modernization of Chinese architecture affect the nationalism that traditional Chinese architecture symbolized, right? So if we think of the treaty ports as really, you know, this kind of like these shameful reminders of, you know, China's defeat, you know, in the Opium Wars, one would think that, you know, the architecture of the treaty ports was also a kind of like, you know,
Yeah.
symbol of that defeat. But yet here we see, you know, middle class, often like middle class Chinese that played an important role in the revolution, embracing these styles. So how would you reconcile that?
Thank you for this question. This is something I wanted to talk about in the introduction, but in interest of time, I cut things out. So this is a really important question because it's fascinating to me. There's this, you know, there's this anti-imperialist narrative, yet such pride in the European architecture. And as Tianjin has developed in more recent years, building new architecture, it's always in this new European style that's being built. So it seems almost contradictory. If we look back from the present, it seems contradictory. But I think if we begin by looking forward, we might understand a little bit more. So one thing I was going to discuss with you today, but decided to leave this out, is the different ways in which people talk about the Japanese concession as opposed to the British concession. So when I visited the former Japanese concession, and I was walking on the street, people would stop me and say, you should go to the Wu Dadao, the 5 great streets. That's what they call the former British concession. They're like, what are you doing here? There's nothing to see. Go there. That's the tourist area. Or, somebody came up to me and said, I really hope the government will buy me out and knock my house down and redevelop it. I want to get out of here. So whereas people in the British concession are quite proud and they have this narrative that we couldn't have lived here before, but now we can, people in the Japanese concession feel abandoned by the government and they're like, buy us out and get us out of here, right? And so like on the one hand, we might think, oh, there's more negative connotations towards Japanese imperialism, but if we start actually in the 1950s when housing starts to get redistributed, in the former British concession, the British club becomes an officers club for the army. The former Manchu prince house becomes the foreign affairs office. I visited a home that was given to a family. The father was a PLA officer and the family was no longer living there, but they were renting it out. So we had, and then there's other grand homes that are kind of like, guest houses for party members. So all of this real estate in the British concession was taken up, whereas in, equally beautiful, impressive, large homes in the Japanese concession were carved up, given to multiple families to dwell in them. And I don't think it's because one house was better than the other. I think it's because at the time, the 1950s, you still had the legacy of that was the most successful property market in the city was the British concession. Right. And so that was the most valuable. That's why the communists took that for themselves, because like they knew this was worth the most according to the market. So I think we have this legacy of the housing market, this legacy of this idea of kind of bourgeois single family housing that has persisted over time. So it's not such a rupture. 1949 isn't this rupture where things magically change. I think that the 20s, 30s, 40s, this is a period where we're working out these ideas about housing and about architecture that have a much longer legacy in the city. And so I think beginning in the past maybe helps us understand this peculiar question about why this European architectural heritage is so valued today.
Great. Zhu Haihui had a question about the difference between Tianjin and Shanghai, and you talk about this in your book. I guess I'm wondering, like, is modernity like a self-conscious preoccupation of the residents of Tianjin the way that it is in Shanghai? And tell me if I'm wrong, but my guess is that it wasn't, because it seems like Shanghai is really, it's really drawing a kind of like a really strong cultural milieu, right? You have a lot of intellectuals and artists and writers moving to Shanghai. And it seems like most of your case studies in Tianjin are this middle class, which is a question I'd also want to ask you about. But yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, when a long time ago, I was going to sort of work on Shanghai, and then I shifted to Tianjin, and I had a language professor who he was born in Beijing. His father actually worked for LaCouture. He lived a bit in Tianjin and then eventually went to Taiwan in the US. And he said, why, he was a literature scholar. He's like, why do you want to work on Tianjin? It was just like warlords and bureaucrats. There's no culture in that city, right? Like Shanghai is kind of was this metropole for intellectual culture, the arts, and this really deliberately self-identifying Shanghai modern. Whereas Tianjin is not a place where that identity developed. And in fact, often there was kind of an awareness of being different than Shanghai. But then I also think that Tianjin is a productive space to think about Chinese urban modernity and the ways in which it combines, both the global and the local and the modern and the tradition within this kind of dialogue with each other, within a very deliberate patchwork and construction. And perhaps I think Tianjin might be a productive space to think about what this might look like in other cities. I think that we really, it's still so understudied, and we need to know more about other cities in China during this time to see if Tianjin is a unique space in juxtaposition with Shanghai, or if other cities look more like this kind of Shanghai ideal or this Tianjin ideal.
Related question from Xin Meng, who thanks you for the presentation. You mentioned Tianjin's treaty board buildings reflect the rising status of women, and she wonders how much impact do you think that the housing in Tianjin had on the overall development of modern gendered space in China at large, not just in Tianjin?
Well, I will say that what women are doing in Tianjin or in Shanghai, what they're reading in magazines, what they're talking about, are impacting other parts of China, right? So we know David Strand in Rickshaw Beijing, he mentions that there were, female students, I believe it must have been in Tianjin or in Beijing, were taking action on something, and female students in Lanzhou were reading about it. So, I mean, due to print culture and the popular press, these things were circulating, and especially Shanghai periodicals were circulating all over the world. And Tianjin was producing some periodicals also that were circulating. So certainly what's happening in cities can be distributed to other places. Also, if you think about mobility of people, right? Like, this is not just Tianjin for Tianjiners. People are moving in and out of this space. It's becoming a more broadly Chinese space. But, we do need to keep in mind that there's something that's happening in urban life at this time that, isn't necessarily everyone in rural China has access to this. And this is also a typical question I got, especially early on. I gave a talk very early on at Nankai University in Tianjin, and students came up to me and they said, why don't you write about something that's really Chinese history, like the peasants? Why are you writing about women in Tianjin? So, it is true. How does this really impact every woman in China? Maybe yes, maybe no, but this is actually, this is a story. This is a story of a large population of urban women in China that hasn't been told and deserves to be told. Whether or not it has like broad implications for the entire peasantry of China at the time, I don't think is the point of telling this story.
You've been really generous with your time. Maybe 2 more questions. Are you up for it?
I'm up for it.
So, I'm curious, you use this term middle class, and I think when I first read the book, I was really sort of startled to see this term particularly used, for modern Chinese history. But then, the archival evidence that you find shows that this is how people refer to themselves during this period. Can you say more about what this term might have meant to someone at the time, right? That it seems like it's not just a financial distinction, but a cultural and aesthetic one.
Yeah. So first, as a historian, there's a particular intervention that I'm making by talking about middle, and I think I'm middle class. I'm not always fully comfortable with just taking that English term without qualification. And this is the middle class is central to Euro-American historical narratives of modernization and industrialization, right? And this is part of the story of the Industrial Revolution, and that that production leaves the home, and the home becomes a site of the middle class, and a lot of ink has been spilled on domesticity, another word. I don't think I use it at all in the book, except to maybe say I don't use it. But domesticity and middle class go hand in hand in the history of Europe, the history of the US, as kind of markers of modernity. And then this enters the Asian studies field through Japanese history. And part of this, I think, is because during the post-war, you have Ezra Vogel saying, with his work on Japan's middle class. And so historians have revisited that term and said, actually, this isn't a new Cold War invention. It existed before. And so Jordan Sand's book on House and Home in Japan was very influential to me. And, what he is arguing is the ways in which Japanese were deliberately constructing a middle class through House and Home. Now, what I think is interesting in the China case is that in the sort of European and American historiography, especially the US historiography, this is a natural development. And the China case denaturalizes it, because it's not something that just develops. It has to be deliberately constructed and invented. And so it makes an intervention in these kind of Euro-American narratives of history that assume a particular kind of historical trajectory. So what does it mean then to invent the middle class in China? There's a little bit of literature on this that has been rising, especially since we see China's new middle class being talked about a lot. One of the first books that dealt with this pretty early on was Marie Claude-Berger's The New Bourgeoisie, and she basically takes a French model. And in that case, China has a case of arrested development, because in Tianjin, they don't develop in the way that the French do, and therefore they never had it. And then Wen Xingye, she talks about middle class and says it's middle class is to be nationalistic, is sort of her definition. So what I want to think about is actually exactly what you're talking about, Lawrence. I like how you go as a culture and aesthetic, right? As an identity and a culture and an aesthetic. And this is not an identity that is being really placed upon people. It's not like a political identity. People aren't coming together and saying, we are the middle class, we demand this. But it is in many ways, Chinese elite urbanites are consuming, engaging like the middle class in other parts of the world, and they're also sometimes talking about it, right? Once in a while, it will come across in a woman's mag. So there's not class consciousness, but there is an awareness that you sometimes find in text. So one example is a article from a Tianjin women's magazine on working women. And the author says, now I'm not really talking about women who work in factories. I'm talking about women of the middle classes, who might work in offices. So to me, this shows that there's also a very kind of keen awareness of where they are in the class structure. But by the same token, I think because this isn't natural, because this isn't, I'm not putting sociological terms onto places, it's a much more flexible and relational concept where people are leveraging multiple capitals to create and forge their status identities. So, I mentioned in the book, a warlord could have, bought a grand house, could have bought the biggest house in the British concession, but he might not know how to live in it. But down the road, you could have the daughter of, a civil servant who is living in a single family home, who is going to Beiyang, normal school, who is reading women's magazines, who actually knows how to live a middle-class life. So it is still very flexible and fluid in this time period. But then what's interesting, what comes out of it, I think, is when it comes to house and home, is the middle-class housing ideal of the single family living according to a particular type of residence, and also the middle-class man having the right to have that housing.
Right. So I'm sorry, I know I just said one more, but actually there are two interesting questions
Okay.
that I think would be interesting follow-ups. One by Leo Luo, who's, I mean, it's a perfect follow-up to your response, which is, he asks, is the relative liberation and self-identification that Tianjin's warlords and self-educated middle class, that freedom that they enjoyed, is that something that was shared by the city commoners? And is it possible for ordinary people to choose their own identity through design when in fact they're surrounded by, foreign world empires and, and capitalists, surrounded by this kind of like violence, right? Like the concessions themselves are enclaves, or were intended as enclaves removed from the rest of China. But, were they that hermetic?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, one issue is there's an issue of sources, right? I mean, how can we understand how people would have experienced and had agency to engage? However, we also have to keep in mind, everybody is living in the same, they're all living in this space. And Tianjin is a small city. You can walk through Tianjin in a day. People could walk through the city. If you're a hawker, you can't easily sell from one place to the next without having a license in each place, but you can, as long as you're willing to pay a license, you can go from one place to the next. So I do think there's kind of a misconception too of like concessions as gated communities, that people can move through these spaces. How did people enjoy this? There's a graduate student at HKU in the architecture school who I'm working with, who is working on the tram. And so the Belgians built a tram that ran around the border of the old Chinese city. And then there's one that kind of ran out to a park. And she's in preliminary research on this. So it's still very new and very exciting. But they got rid of the classes in the tram. So they began and they had classes, but they got rid of them. And it was very popular for people to ride. And again, it's very preliminary, so she hasn't gotten all the data, but I think that this was people actually local Tianjin, let's say commoners, for lack of a better word, riding the tram for entertainment. And it was the average Tianjiners, not the elites. The elites, you'll take a rickshaw or a car. You don't, again, it's a small city. You don't need the tram to get around the city. That it was a form of entertainment, right? And you have things like cinema. You have different kinds of restaurants. So you have these different ways in which people across the city can engage. And engaging in different forms of design, actually, by doing that. But again, I think this word freedom, right, is kind of problematic. It's more agency I would like to use rather than freedom, because the agency is confined by this very violent colonial experience. But it's also a colonial capitalist experience. So there are Chinese men who have access to, large amounts of capital, who can express a lot of agency in this space. And I'm not saying this is like a great thing, right? But this is how the system is working.
Right. And this is how compradors make their bread and butter, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
So last question. Ramisa Ahmed asked, well, thanks you again for an insightful presentation. You mentioned that the concession kitchen was developed as a space for the working class rather than just women, which was unlike the spatial division that we've seen in traditional Chinese homes. In regard to gendered spaces in the homes that you showcased, was the elimination of women-only areas happening throughout the structure, or was it confined to things like the basement? And how do you think the urban women of this period help in shaping the overall narrative of Chinese spaces as compared to lower class or rural population?
So yeah, I mean, I think that the kitchen was an amazing, amazing discovery for me in this project. And looking at, I mean, I surveyed so many Chinese women's magazines from across China, and I think I've come across two images of kitchens. One is a cartoon that makes fun of a woman in a qipao trying to cook in the kitchen, and the other is an image of a Japanese woman in a kitchen. So these were not these sites of female fantasy. In fact, articles would talk about you need to know how to cook so you can tell your cook how to cook, was what women's magazines would say, right? So these never really became gendered female spaces in the same way. So what I think about in the book, because the aim of the book is also to go beyond house and home and also rethink space in the city. And so and actually think about different genderings of space. So the inner and outer of late imperial China, how that interacts with the public-private that is being developed in concessions like the Italian concessions, but then how are people navigating this and creating the space? I don't want to take any of this for granted, that these spaces just are built and they exist and people are put into the boxes. I think people are shaping and creating. So one of the chapters thinks about women and space in the city. And what I find is it's based on this debate that comes through in a women's magazine about home, society, and the social sphere is what they call it. So home and society is where we're working out these tensions of gender in terms of home in the world, right? So is home the center of society and women's place is in the home to make society better? Or is home in opposition to society and women need to escape the home to get into society and realize their self-identity and their self-worth? So this is one debate that's happening, but then there's another discussion that comes out about the social sphere. And the social sphere is, as I mentioned, the social sphere is, there's an elite social sphere. There's also the kind of working classes social sphere, but this is kind of the site of entertainment, of cinema, of hotels, of restaurants, of ice skating, of dating, right? This is a new kind of sphere in the city, and it's in this social sphere that women really dominate in this space, and they're very successful in this space, often as appendages of their husband or their family. So, a woman will appear on the cover of a pictorial magazine as the wife of so-and-so, the daughter of so-and-so. But also what's interesting is sometimes you can jump the social status of your family, of your male family members, by being a successful woman in the social sphere, right? So women depicted in the social sphere are, wives of politicians and businessmen, but then you also, one woman appears who's the daughter of a magician, right? And I highly think a magician is as high status as Wellington Koo, but they are both, these women attached to these men are on the cover of these. So this is sort of women creating new spaces within the city, within the this new kind of social sphere that is developing at this time.
Great, Elizabeth, thank you very much. I didn't even get to ask you what you're working on next, but
Hong Kong women. I'm stuck in Hong Kong, right? I can't leave Hong Kong. So no one has ever written on Hong Kong women's magazines. So that'll be.
But you will. Yeah.
But I will, yes.
Well, thank you very much
Thank
for that
you.
really wonderful lecture and for being so generous with your time and answering all these questions. Yeah, and I hope I get to see you soon in person.
Yes, yes. I hope everybody can come to Hong Kong soon. I really
Yeah,
do.
yeah.
Okay.
All right, well, have a great day. Yeah, and we'll chat later. Thank you.
Okay. Good evening to everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.